Good morning. I'm Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the first in a series of what we believe will be important conversations and opportunities to work together. We appreciate that in so many ways, you all are truly the front line for what it takes to defend our democracy. You all are the election officials and teams that ensure that all of us are able to vote safely and securely. We appreciate that your jobs were difficult before there was a pandemic, and now they're more challenging still. But I think by partnering with the Brennan Center and CISA, by working and talking together, we all have the opportunity to do what it takes to ensure that we will have a safe and secure election this year. The topics that we'll talk about in the coming weeks and months are so clearly important. Issues like what it takes to ensure secure remote working, or resiliency when it comes to voting by mail. Important issues like patching, and ultimately the broad array of questions that we'll all have to work through together as a country and at the state and local level to ensure that our democracy does what it needs to do this fall. We have a lot of work ahead at Microsoft. We look forward to contributing, to learning from you, to all working together. That is what the country needs. I think it's what together we provide. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Bing. I'm a cybersecurity reporter with Reuters. Welcome to Building Election Resilience, where we'll be discussing the topic of election security in the United States. Today's conversation will be organized in two sections: a panel discussion that lasts roughly 30 minutes, followed by 15 minutes for audience questions. We have a great lineup of speakers today, but before we get started, I wanted to just make a brief remark to recognize the context in which we're having this conversation. As everyone is aware, there is legitimate unrest, anger, and sadness across the country amid ongoing protests concerning police brutality and racial inequality. Today's discussion about the security and integrity of the elections process is important, in part because of the events surrounding us. While so many Americans seek change, it is vital that voters feel like their voice counts at the ballot box and that elections are protected and conducted efficiently and effectively. With that being said, let's get started with some introductions.
Hi, I'm Gowri Ramachandran, counsel in the Election Security Program at the Brennan Center. Thank you so much to all of you for participating in this program, and in particular to all the election officials and staff who are on the front lines of providing free and fair elections in what are extremely challenging times, to say the least. I really see one of my roles in that process is gathering expertise and ideas for how to do that, much of it from all of you, and sharing it in a way that I hope is useful and facilitates getting that job done. So I look forward to learning from and working with all of you, not just today, but in the months to come.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Masterson. I'm a senior cybersecurity advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, within DHS. Good afternoon to all the election officials on the call. I know how valuable your time is, how hard you've been working under unprecedented circumstances to support your voters, to run elections and to plan for November. And I hope the information shared here today is of use to you. And I thank you for your partnership with CISA throughout the last 2 years, and particularly this year. And thanks to Microsoft for organizing and allowing me to participate.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Burt. I'm Vice President at Microsoft for Customer Security and Trust, and my team includes both our Digital Crimes Unit and the Defending Democracy program that we have at Microsoft. And like Gowri and Matt, I thank you all for taking the time to participate in this session today. I believe it's just the first of what are expected to be a series of these sessions where we can drill down into some of the more challenging issues and provide the advice and assistance that we can provide to all of you who, as Brad said, are so much on the front lines of trying to ensure that we have a free, fair, and safe election this fall. So appreciate all of that, and look forward both to the opportunity to talk with you today and to trying to address some of your questions later on in the program.
To begin our conversation today, I thought it'd be practical to talk about the current state of play. What does the cyber threat landscape look like for election officials? Tom and Matt, what have you been seeing in this space so far as we approach November, and why do you think it's happening?
Let me jump in real quickly. At Microsoft, we have the Microsoft Threat Information Center. We call it MISTIC by the acronym, and they track the activities of 70 different nation-state activity groups from around the world, 30 that we focus on any given time. And what we are seeing, and we reported last fall that we had seen an activity group from Iran that had engaged in a wide range of attempts to attack a number of different people, including one staffer in a presidential campaign. But since that time, we really have not seen that much activity that appears to be election related. We weren't too surprised because that's consistent with what we've seen in 2016, 2018, and in elections around the world, which is that the adversaries, the nation state actors who are trying to interfere in the democratic processes around the world, have a playbook where they will start to try to hack into the policy leaders, the trusted advisors to campaigns, as a means both of getting information about what campaigns are up to, but also find a trusted way to infiltrate the campaign themselves. And we were expecting to see that kind of activity begin to increase as we get closer to the election. But what happened, of course, is we had COVID-19, and we saw both from cyber criminals and nation state actors a big pivot towards COVID-19 techniques and targets. And we really saw a lot of the activity pivoting into that area. But as many of you may have seen, yesterday, Google announced that they saw 2 activity groups targeting presidential campaigns. And it's really interesting what they reported, because they saw the same group that we saw last fall, group we call Phosphorus, that operates out of Iran. They saw that group, they reported, targeting staffers on the Trump campaign. And they saw another group that we also track, a group that operates out of China, targeting staffers on the Biden campaign. And this may very well be then the next step in what we saw beginning last fall. It's great that Google is joining us in being public about what we're seeing in our networks relative to attacks on campaigns, electoral process. That's what the private sector can do. We can watch those networks. We can provide that information to all of you so you know what we're seeing. Of course, Microsoft, we have our free service that's called Account Guard. It's available to all of you who are election officials and your staff. And through that process, we specifically monitor your Office 365 accounts and the Microsoft related consumer accounts, so that if you have people on your staff who interact with you through consumer accounts, you can add those, you can opt in to add those into the system, and we will closely monitor all those accounts for any nation state activity and notify you right away. We're actually now monitoring 1.8 million different accounts through Account Guard, in part because we expanded it temporarily to cover healthcare organizations just last month. For monitoring the 1.8 million, we've done over 1,500 nation state notifications. So it's a useful service to get you information about what's going on and whether you and your organization are under attack.
Do you have anything to add on that? What has DHS, from your perspective, been seeing in this space? Are you already seeing activity, or is it relatively calm?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think Tom hit the nail on the head. We remain vigilant and ever aware. We continue to work with state and local officials and their private sector partners, whether it's Microsoft or other election system providers, to really monitor what activity they're seeing. We have intrusion detection sensors on election infrastructure across all 50 states. So our level of visibility and information sharing with election officials is far greater than it was in 2016. And that's really critical to understand threat actor activity, but also just the risk environment as a whole. From our perspective, we know that our adversaries see strategic gain to be found in the 2020 elections, and they're going to use the election in order to pursue those gains and policies. We also know that we continue to receive reports from those election officials and private sector partners about just ongoing activity targeting election infrastructure. And so we have to remain vigilant and aware. And so much of our focus is taking the information that we're getting about activity about scanning or probing of networks and taking that and applying that to the risk environment that we now understand for election officials. So working to understand what base level cyber services can we provide to election officials, things like remote penetration testing, cyber hygiene scanning. How can we then take trend analysis from that information from the field and share it with the election officials in the private sector in order to improve the overall risk posture? And then what steps can they take in a shifting risk landscape, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, to manage risks within COVID, changing processes, changing infrastructure. So we're looking at things, simple base level cyber hygiene steps that will help secure the networks, will help detect possible intrusions and inform the entire elections community. So things like network segmentation and understanding that networked election systems like statewide voter registration databases, which we're going to talk about, are the largest threat surface, contain the most risk. And so how do we help manage that? How do we manage and inform the humans involved in the elections process? As elections ramp up, you add more and more partners, whether that's poll workers, election workers, or private sector partners. And so are you holding them to the same accountability that you're holding your staff? Are you patching networks? Are you upgrading outdated systems or unsupported systems? Are you managing those access controls? Because those foundational elements are critical to managing the risk, whether we're talking about APT activity or just general cyber actors looking to take advantage of weaknesses in our election infrastructure. And so that ability to communicate with thousands of election officials at once, to work with the private sector, folks like Microsoft, Google, and others, to share this information and provide threat briefings is really at the core of what we're trying to do to prepare for November.
That's a good place to bring in Gowri. The Brennan Center has been carefully studying and producing recommendations around the election process for some time. So given some of what Tom and Matt said about the threat, Gowri, what are some of the popular recommendations that the Brennan Center has been passing on to states so far?
Sure, thank you. So actually, we have been making recommendations for some time, and actually today, the Brennan Center is publishing a report that so many election officials, many of you, cybersecurity experts, and election security experts have helped us put together, and it's called Preparing for Cyber Attacks and Technical Problems During the Pandemic. So in it, we're providing a list of resiliency recommendations, really practical ideas that can still be done between now and November to prevent a successful cyber attack on the infrastructure or technical malfunction, and importantly, to ensure that even if there is a cyber attack or technical malfunction, and even in the midst of this pandemic, that eligible voters aren't going to be stymied from participating in the election. So I think one of the most important ideas we have in there is beefing up the capacity and security and resiliency of all the online tools that voters are using as they're primarily staying at home. So online voter registration, online mail ballot request tools, and actually just email systems that voters are using to communicate with election officials during the pandemic. All these systems are getting a lot more traffic than in the past, and we can expect that to increase even further as voters get ready to participate in the November general election. So for instance, for online tools, we recommend that election officials obtain the services of a good content delivery network that'll distribute traffic over multiple servers. They can batch requests that are being sent through these tools. So when you have a surge in legitimate traffic from voters to their websites, that doesn't cause the site to go down. We're also recommending that election officials can customize the redirect pages. So those are the pages where the voters get sent to if one of the tools does go down, maybe because there's so much traffic that the backend server just can't handle all of it. So that customized page could at least collect contact information from the voter, preserve the fact that they were trying to register or trying to request a mail ballot in a timely fashion, and provide an avenue for election officials to, have the voters' contact information and follow up with them and help them with whatever it was they were trying to accomplish. Another really important recommendation I'd love to highlight from the report, a new one we have, is resiliency of the email servers that a lot of officials are using to accept voter requests for mail ballots. So a lot of voters are filling out a mail ballot request on paper and then scanning it in or taking a photograph of it and emailing that as an attachment to election officials. And those attachments can be big. Election officials are, receiving attachments from people that they don't communicate with regularly, just the voting public. So we're recommending that officials check and increase the capacity of their email servers and adjust their junk mail filters so the applications don't get lost or bounce back. And we also recommend that officials, if possible, create a dedicated email address for receiving those applications so that you can use virus scanning software on those attachments, even open them on a different device that's dedicated to that purpose, that has really strong network protections. So that way the legitimate applications don't get filtered out, they get processed, but at the same time, all those email attachments don't become a vector for an attack. And then finally, we're recommending sort of resiliency measures like sending voters confirmations of all these online transactions, and in particular, sending the confirmations to any contact information that the official had on file previously. That way, if there is malicious activity, for instance, someone changing voter addresses without their consent or asking for a mail ballot that the voter didn't want, the voters can alert election officials to those potential compromises if they're receiving these confirmation methods.
So we live currently in a context with the coronavirus. Aside from all the novel cyber threats that are facing the election, the coronavirus is going to change and make certain components of the election more complex. Tom, could you give us a little bit of an overview about the state of affairs when it comes to how the coronavirus is affecting the elections? And Matt, also weigh in a bit here.
Well, sure. Let's start with what we're seeing in terms of the kinds of activity from the adversary countries. When I refer to the adversary countries, the vast majority of the nation state traffic we see comes from 4 countries, from Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. And that's been true when we've been watching for nation state activity as well. So when you're thinking about the resiliency, you're thinking about the kinds of things that Gowri just covered in terms of the things you need to do to strengthen your system. You are all facing really well-resourced, really capable governments that are trying to interfere in your election process. In the world of COVID, they are going to use whatever changes in the system to their advantage. So what we know right now and what you are all facing is a great deal of uncertainty. How are you going to conduct your elections in November? For those of you who have the legal authority to do more vote by mail or can get that legal authority, you may be working really hard right now to establish those systems. For others, and we wrote a publication with some recommendations on this, you may have portable voting systems or even a drive-through voting. And all of these things are going to depend, of course, on the public health position in your states and in your communities. And so I will assume that you are all going to be working very closely with your public health officials to understand just how much do you need to change your already well-established voting processes because of COVID-19. And so all of that means a great deal of uncertainty, which puts your world in a much more challenging spot from a cybersecurity perspective, because until you lock down on what your process is, you can't begin to build in that security and the resiliency that we talked about. There are a number of things that you can do in addition to exploring these different things. I mean, an example is, our account guard service is free. If you haven't signed up for it, I strongly recommend you do. That will help for things like Gowri was talking about, the email that you may be getting transmitting applications for mail-in ballots. That is absolutely a vector that the bad guys will try to take advantage of by mailing in fake applications where the attachments are weaponized attachments as a way to try to infiltrate your system. So the Brennan Center's recommendations for segregating onto a separate system or network the receipt and verification of those applications, super important. But we can help with account guard as well, because we may see coming from the nation state actor that traffic and be able to alert you that you're under attack. We also have a program we call Election Security Advisors, and this is a revenue program. We do charge for it, but we have a very low price for this service because we know that all of the election officials around the country are very budget constrained. This is a service we provide to our top, our biggest enterprise customers, and we've substantially discounted the same service for election purposes. And we can do two things. If you'd like, we can come in and work with you to really look hard at the security environment you have in your system and provide actual practical advice on what to do to improve in advance the security of your system. We can also help you respond if you're attacked and you need help. Election security advisors can help, and we'll actually take a team out to your location to get the on-site to try to help you respond quickly. But of course, in the election environment, as I'm sure you all know, it's going to be much better to be have a good defense than to try to recover after the fact. We also, of course, have Microsoft Teams using it today. It's a great secure collaboration tool. And so it's the kind of thing, and there are other similar tools elsewhere, but this one has a high degree of security. It enables collaboration and communication in a secure way. But just with all of those, in the COVID world, you just have to expect that all of the changes that you're thinking about making, all of those decisions that you're waiting to make to see how you're going to conduct your election, adversaries are going to be looking at those decisions and at those choices and how they can use those to attack your system and try to infiltrate it and influence the outcome of the election.
Matt, Tom just laid out kind of some of the new cyber complications of a COVID-influenced election. Can you expand on that at all? How does COVID kind of introduce new challenges or new processes that election officials should be mindful of?
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'm always hesitant to tell election officials how it's going to change their operation because they understand their operation best. The reality is with 8,800 or so local election offices, each operation is different to meet the needs of their voters and given the resources they have. What we see overall from talking to election officials and engaging with them is varying degrees of adjustment of process and therefore introduction of new technologies to respond to COVID. So as Tom touched on, whether it's expansion of absentee balloting, that shifts some risk towards things like the security of the voter registration database, introduction of new processes or systems such as ballot sorting, ballot processing, perhaps central count scanning. And so understanding, okay, what does that risk dynamic look like now that I've shifted away from perhaps a largely polling place operation to a more absentee operation? Where is data coming in from? What am I connecting within my own network now? What vendors am I allowing into my network space now, right? So managing those third-party providers, new mail houses, new vendors that help to track ballots. What's that look like? How am I giving them access to my data? How are we exchanging that data? And am I holding them to the same standard that I was holding my own operation? What protections do they have? Simple steps like, do they have two-factor authentication? Am I managing their accesses only to the information that they need instead of giving them broad access into my systems? And so what CISA's tried to do is partner with the Election Assistance Commission, our government coordinating council and sector coordinating councils to create some guidance to meet election officials where they are. So if they're expanding absentee balloting, if they're looking at curbside voting or other forms of expanded in-person voting, for instance, through larger vote centers, because they can't recruit enough workers to have as many polling places, how can we meet the election officials where they are as they explore what their options are? And I think Tom absolutely hit the nail on the head. For election officials, uncertainty is absolutely the worst enemy. Election officials are planners, are risk managers by nature, and this type of quick introduction of uncertainty is uncomfortable for most election officials. They want to pilot things. They want to test things over the series 2, 3, 4 elections to understand the implications, not just on their processes, but on their systems. And so this COVID environment has forced a level of adaptation that is not typically used in elections. Elections tend to be evolutionary, not revolutionary in that way. And so managing and understanding what risk has been introduced. So what CIS has done is worked with the Government Coordinating Council and Sector Coordinating Council to create first a timeline of considerations if you're looking at expanding vote by mail. So what are the steps you may have to take? What are the possible timeframes that it will take to introduce new processes and procedures? And then broken down the processes into various swim lanes with tangible advice from election officials to election officials. So this isn't CISA creating and producing these documents, but instead working to talk to election officials about things like introduction of ballot drop boxes, electronic ballot delivery and marking. So if you're going to expand the use of your electronic ballot delivery and marking system beyond UOCAVA voters, what are the cybersecurity considerations? How are you managing that risk? The importance of accurate voter data when expanding mail balloting. What are the implications of your on your voter registration database? The importance of that information. Managing the postal service, and then in-person voting. Things like considering the modifying the scale of in-person voting, voter lookup and information portals. How do you manage the risk and information? Because what we recognize is even if the integrity of the election remains in place, if voters are confused, if voters don't have the information they need, that is an active space for adversaries to take advantage of, to sow doubt, to cause confusion amongst voters, and that could be as impactful as any actual cyber event. And so how are you communicating the changes with your voters? How are you, as an election official, being the trusted source of information within your community about the elections process, that they understand, okay, I don't need to turn to Facebook and some guy posting on my Facebook wall for this information. I know my local election official, my state election official have the information I need about, am I registered? What's on my ballot? How can I participate, whether it's absentee, in person, or otherwise? And how do I know that my vote will be counted as cast? And so embracing that transparency, but managing the risks around all of that is critically important. And then the last one I'd mention is CISA's produced, beyond just the election context, a variety of resources around telework. As election officials are moving more and more to telework, how do you manage the risk? How do you understand what steps you can take in order to protect your systems? And so I'd encourage everyone, if you go to CISA.gov, Protect 2020, so CISA.gov/Protect 2020, all these resources are available for you all to use.
Gowri, maybe you can pull on some of the threads that Matt laid out there. The Brennan Center has obviously offered recommendations specifically for this new coronavirus type environment. What are some specific recommendations that you'd like to tell election officials about?
Sure. So I think one thing I want to emphasize is that I really agree with Tom and Matt that the uncertainty is just unprecedented and a real challenge here. In some ways, officials are being asked to prepare for two elections, a largely vote by mail election and an in-person election with potential poll worker shortages due to the pandemic. And the reason that, unfortunately, officials need to, in a sense, prepare for both is that in-person voting is essentially the emergency backup for mail voting. So if a voter didn't receive their mail ballot in time, they may have to show up at the polls in person to vote. Or if a cyber attack causes mail ballots to get sent to the wrong addresses, then voters might not receive them and need to vote in person. And we've been seeing in these recent primaries, like on Tuesday, that even during a pandemic, and even with no cyber attack that we know of occurring, there are voters that need to vote in person. And the last thing we want during a pandemic is long lines that make it difficult for them to socially distance. So in addition to a lot of the recommendations we've made around mail voting and online voter registration and those sorts of things, we're also repeating some of the recommendations we've made in the past with some slight adjustments involving in-person voting. So for instance, if a polling place is using ballot marking devices or ballot on demand printers, there need to be emergency paper ballots on hand for voters in case those machines go down so that they can still continue to vote and operate as a fail-safe. If hand-marked paper ballots are the primary method of voting in person, we recommend having enough on hand for all the voters who didn't request a mail ballot and then some. So that would typically be about 120% of the voters who didn't ask for a mail ballot. And this is really important in states where voters are unfamiliar with mail voting. It's not a common practice in some states. And so they may decide to turn out in person instead. once we get to November. We're also recommending, as we always have, having plenty of provisional envelopes on hand for in-person voting. It might be very important during the pandemic to have that, as many jurisdictions require voters that requested a mail ballot to vote provisionally if they show up on election day at the polls. And so there may be an increase in just the amount of use of provisional voting because of voters requesting a mail ballot, but then at the end of the day preferring to vote in person or needing to vote in person because they didn't receive it in time. Huge amount of uncertainty. It's a lot to prepare for. And I want to acknowledge that that might make some of the recommendations we're making seem like Herculean tasks, particularly in the face of, massive cuts to local government budgets. And that's part of why we at the Brennan Center, at least, are strongly encouraging Congress to provide more funding for state and local officials to run their elections. And we would encourage election officials to contact their members of Congress and let them know that the money they've allocated is not enough. There are a lot of election official associations engaged in those sorts of efforts, and we're really appreciative of that because it's really difficult for officials to plan for what's essentially two different elections at the same time.
So just narrowing our focus a little bit and looking back at the last presidential election in 2016, we obviously know that voter registration databases were one of these juicy targets for nation states, and voter registration databases are talked a lot about being a target of hacking, obviously. With vote by mail and the expansion of vote by mail, I've heard that these voter registration databases are even more important. Tom, for the whole group, really, can you give us a little bit of outlay about where sort of security around voter registration databases stands, as well as perhaps some thoughts or advice on security of these specific systems as well, given their importance?
Thoughts, and I know that the other panelists will have other useful things to add to this, but clearly the voter registration databases were in 2016 a target of efforts to infiltrate. I think we all expect them to be a target this time around, and therefore it's going to be very important that we take steps necessary to defend those systems and make them resilient. One of the things that Chris Krebs, the director of CISIS, talked about, that we've talked about, is the risk of ransomware. And it's really, this is a critical risk, I think, for these systems in particular. There has been a huge increase in ransomware targeting municipal organizations throughout the United States over the last year and a half, very successfully. And this is cybercrime. These are people who are doing it to make money. And then you add to that the chance that nation state actors can easily acquire on the dark web the ransomware systems that are actively sold through the dark web, and can acquire ransomware systems, use the techniques that they use to try to hack into your system, and then they'll encrypt all of your data and you won't be able to access it or use it. So this is a critical risk. And one that you very well may see both coming from just a cyber criminal who wants to extort you and your government for money, or a nation state actor who's actually trying to interfere with the election. And as we pivot more and more to vote by mail and other systems where that voter registration system is going to be critical, and it's critical when you're on-premise voting as well, that is something that we encourage all of you to really pay attention to. What can you do to be resilient against ransomware with your voter registration database? And turn it over to Gowri and Matt to give more on that. And I believe that we're going to have a future session really focused on ransomware as part of this series of discussions.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, definitely. We know that voter registration databases were a target, and you can see why they would remain one. A lot of chaos can be caused by an attack on the voter registration database. So, and that remains true during the pandemic. So, for instance, voters might not get their mail ballots if the database is corrupted. They might appear to be ineligible to vote when they show up in person. There's a lot of really huge impacts that could come from an attack on the voter registration database. We definitely recommend provisional ballots as a fail-safe for that reason, whether those are provisional mail ballots or provisional in-person ballots. Both of them are necessary as a fail-safe in case voters appear to be ineligible due to an attack on the database. But obviously that's not ideal. It's a last resort. Provisional materials are time-consuming to fill out. They're time-consuming to process for officials. And that's one of the reasons why we're hoping in one of the future sessions in this series to really do a deep dive on protecting against ransomware. I'm really looking forward to that one.
Matt, jump on in.
Will do. Yeah, I think the other panelists have really touched on this well, and I won't dwell on ransomware except to say it's been a primary focus for us at CISA, working with state and local officials in the private sector. We've talked with Tom and Microsoft quite a bit too, in part because of the obvious impact it would have, the devastating impact in particularly local jurisdictions. If you don't have backups, if you haven't tested those backups, if you're not prepared to respond, the amount of time and money, let alone the impact on confidence in the election, would be immense. So if you think about election officials in their resource-starved environment, perhaps the most valuable resource that they have is time. Every day that they use to respond to a ransomware incident and recover is time that they don't have to respond and prepare for the election, because you can do very little without that voter registration data. Two is looking at the overall risk profile of voter registration databases, particularly at the state level in this case. Voter registration databases are no longer just the list of registered voters with their identifying information. They're really the backbone for many other peripheral systems, whether it's voter lookup tools, ballot tracking, military and overseas ballot delivery systems. The voter registration database has really become an election management system in many states as they work. And so the risk vector, as well as the dependencies on the VRDB is increased in complexity over time quite a bit. So if you combine that then with the COVID environment, where lots of changes are being made, whether it's to prepare for different in-person voting experiences or vote by mail, and you're introducing new systems, new vendors, and new risks, and those dependencies quickly, are you taking the steps to properly manage the risks and access the voter registration database? And so a lot of the work that we've done with state and local partners has really been focused on who has access to that database, what kind of access do they have, why do they need it, and how are you limiting that so that items like ransomware can't be easily deployed in your environment. If you can segment out folks to only really those that need that access and limiting the amount of control they have, whether it's vendor side or otherwise, you've really managed to understand that risk. The other thing on voter registration databases, and it relates to COVID, but overall, is understanding that it's not just about what could be done with the data in the database, but also understanding the value of the data itself. We know that adversaries have interest in voter registration data in general, right? Understanding the electorate, whether it's coming from election officials, campaigns, other third-party organizations, voter registration data is important and usable to target the American electorate, right? And so understanding the nature of the data that you have, what your data file and file formats look like, such that if we see data posted on the dark web or for sale somewhere else, can we identify the source, and is that freely available data? As we know, states sell voter registration data, or some states offer it for free. What do those data files look like, or is this something more than that? And then asking yourself, how do I know if something's wrong with my voter registration data? What audits do I have in place that I have the ability to detect that there's an issue? Do I have monitoring of the system? Do I have human eyes on it looking for anomalies as far as absentee ballot requests or ballot tracking systems, so that I have some informed protectors of the system that can say, oh yeah, we might have something going on here. And then what are my early indicators? So things like early voting, things like absentee ballot mailings can provide an early indicator that there might be an issue with statewide data, because you begin to get things like return mail, or voters showing up having to vote provisionally as part of early voting. And so your ability to track and identify that as an election official, to be able to say, this is abnormal, this is more than we would have expected, what steps do I have in place, what are my incident response protocols, really become critical. And then understanding your data sources. So we all know election officials are very dependent on Bureau of Motor Vehicles and other state agencies for voter registration information. How are they sharing that information? How are you able to manage and understand the integrity of their data? Because that becomes critical before it ever gets into the voter registration database. So that's just a few of the challenges that exist, particularly in this dynamic environment with COVID.
And Chris, just jump back in again. This is Tom.
Yeah,
you know, that's all great advice, and we endorse all of that. With all that said, it's clear, at least from the Microsoft perspective, as we look at the risk environment, that all of the voting officials who are working so hard are facing this cycle. Ransomware is a particularly significant risk, and that's because the bad guys are really good at it. The software that enables it is well established. The attack vectors that they use to get into your system, they're really good at it. They're very persistent. Just one example, we had one nation state actor that used 2,700 attacks in order to be successful just 4 times. They have those kinds of resources. They're very persistent. So one of the things, and Matt mentioned this, it's super important in this space, is to make sure that for these critical systems, like your voter registration database, you have a complete, up-to-date, constantly updated, but offline backup, and that you do the exercise. And I know that, as Matt said, time is a critical resource, but because of this particular risk, we would encourage you to do the exercise of actually setting up that backup and restoring that backup. Assume that you got hacked, assume that you had your entire voter registration database locked up by ransomware. How quickly can you reestablish that database from your backup is going to be an important exercise for you to go through. But I know we'll cover more of this in the subsequent session that's going to really focus on ransomware. But I just wanted to put that pitch in for those who aren't able to participate later, because it is going to be a critical hygiene exercise for all of you to be on top of.
Yeah, and Chris, sorry, this is Matt. Just to build on this, as I pre-COVID was traveling around the country meeting with state and local officials across the country, that the reality of ransomware hits home because it doesn't matter, small jurisdiction, medium jurisdiction, largest jurisdiction, they're just looking to take advantage of a soft target, deploy ransomware, and try to make some money. And so we see across state and local government, the smallest jurisdictions, the largest, well-resourced, not well-resourced, getting hit with ransomware because it's opportunistic. So no one is free from the scourge of ransomware, as it were. And so those protections are critically important. And the good news is, if you're protecting yourself against ransomware, taking the steps like Tom mentioned with backups, good cyber hygiene, patching, upgrades, you're also protecting yourself from a lot of other things. So ransomware is a nice driving force for change, because not many jurisdictions in this country have the resources to recover unless you've prepared in advance.
So with that, we are concluding the panel session of the event. We're now going to move into the Q&A. And so to be able to get to multiple questions from the audience, we're just going to spend about 2 minutes for each answer, and I'm going to ask a specific panelist to answer that question. The first question is for Matt. The question is, are there any lessons, good or bad, that U.S. election officials can take away from other countries who've conducted elections during the coronavirus pandemic? Have you learned of other lessons from other countries that may be applied here at home, that could be applied at home?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. The answer is absolutely. So in working with the Government Coordinating Council and Sector Coordinating Council, the private sector folks that run elections, we leveraged information from other countries, South Korea being a notable example, that have run elections through COVID, and tried to use that and incorporate those in the documents that are posted on the CISA.gov Protect 2020 page, because the experience that they have gone through has really helped inform us. We've also worked closely with the CDC and Postal Service, who have talked and worked internationally as well to understand the implications of COVID on elections. And then finally, not just internationally, but we continue to work with election officials that have had to run primary elections here in America during COVID. So we've worked closely with folks from Florida and Illinois and Wisconsin that were really in the midst of the whole thing, having to respond and the lessons learned that they had. So we tried to take inputs from experience, from lessons learned, and incorporate them into the documents. The other thing I'll say is much of the information that's in those documents we anticipate updating as we learn additional lessons from around the country and around the world. So yes, I would encourage anyone. South Korea put out a really good guide on their response to COVID and elections that's worth looking at.
All right, next question from the audience. This one is going to be for Tom. Is this the right time for internet voting with the coronavirus planning? Matt's kind of laughing at this question. There's a lot of pressure, obviously, across the country in places to offer some sort of internet voting, especially for those that are overseas or for those voters with disabilities. Tom, being involved in a major technology company, is now the right time to start deploying some of this technology?
I think now is the right time to deploy technology that you can make safe and secure and practical and workable. And so I think for most election officials, that does not include internet voting, which would be a new step, a new technology, a whole new process. There have been a few states that have used internet voting for absentee voting, and for things like that, it can be a very good solution, or for service people overseas and so forth. Our position is that internet voting does expose your systems to a broader range of potential cyber attack. And today, it is not the most secure approach relative to some of the other approaches that are tried and true and well understood. That's why, for example, and many of you have probably heard about our election guard technology that we piloted in an election in Wisconsin earlier this year. It won't be ready to be adopted broadly this year for this election cycle, but it's one that we would use in the future. And it supports paper ballots, ballot marking devices, scanning of paper ballots, a wide range of different voting techniques, but we haven't yet expanded it to purely internet voting because of some of the security challenges of really being able to do end-to-end verifiable voting in that way.
Next audience question here. This one is for Gowri. What methods are considered best to ensure the secure transmission of votes from balloting locations to processing/counting centers?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that more election officials are going to have to pay a bit more attention to in this year's election than they may have previously. In particular, jurisdictions that may be adding secure drop boxes to make it convenient for voters to drop off their mail ballots and be sure that they were received in time by the deadline. Essentially, bipartisan teams is a common standard or rule that's used to ensure that election officials or poll workers are not left alone with ballots. Maintaining good chain of custody logs is another best practice. The Election Assistance Commission has some materials available on their website with some of the standard best practices in this regard. And so, yeah, chain of custody logs, using either bipartisan teams or, making sure at least that nobody is alone with marked ballots are very important best practices. And I would also add, this isn't quite part of the question, but it's also important to ensure that blank ballots that are being mailed to voters are kept secure. So there may be jurisdictions that are moving towards working with print vendors that they haven't worked with before to help them accommodate the increase in mail voting, having someone else help them with printing the whole mail ballot packet, addressing it, and sending it out. It's important that those vendors follow best practices in terms of keeping chain of custody logs and limiting, access to voter data only to those personnel who need it in order to produce the ballot packets.
Next question, this one is going to be from Matt. Does DHS encourage other states to follow the Delaware, New Jersey, West Virginia model of introducing internet voting for certain voters, or does the agency discourage this? Yeah,
so appreciate the question. CISA recently worked with NIST, the FBI, and the EAC to offer a risk assessment to election officials regarding online ballot delivery, online ballot marking, and then online ballot return. And so online, the gist of it being that online ballot delivery and marking, you can put in appropriate technical controls and processes in order to manage the risk and keep it a low risk exercise, low to medium risk exercise. The reality with online ballot return is even with mitigations, it's a largely high risk enterprise. And so we really encourage the use of auditable records. That ability for the voter to verify and return an auditable ballot is critically important, particularly in an environment where we know adversaries are trying to undermine confidence in the process. That ability to know and verify and audit the elections really critical, and largely it can't be done with online ballot return. But we also recognize that there is a subset of voters, a small subset of voters, that would otherwise be completely disenfranchised if the option is not available to them. And so election officials, that are looking at this technology, limiting it to a very small subset of those who would otherwise not have the ability to vote at all and have their vote counted as cast, is part of this risk equation too. So again, online ballot delivery and marking, the risk can be managed, but online ballot return remains a high risk enterprise.
Gowri, one of the audience would like to ask this question is, if election officials want to know more to grow their knowledge base, at least when it comes to cybersecurity and understanding how this technology fundamentally works at its basic level, what resources do you recommend for them to read up on and to access?
That's a great question, and I think it really highlights how the job of being an election official is now, becoming a lot of different jobs at once. There's a lot of new areas that officials need to get up to speed on. We hope at the Brennan Center that some of the materials we provide are written in a way that's, understandable for lay people. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be, an IT professional or a cybersecurity expert to understand the simple recommendations that we're trying to provide. CISA also provides great resources on their website that Matt has mentioned earlier in the panel that I think are actually written in a way that's really understandable to someone who's not, someone with a computer science degree or a cybersecurity certificate of any kind. So those are helpful resources. I also think the private sector has really stepped up in terms of trying to provide resources for election officials. So those are some of the recommendations I would make.
Okay, we're going to, let's see. I'll give this one to Tom. What are practical applications of information security that can be applied to our day-to-day operations? I believe this is probably being asked by an election official, not a reporter.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, and really have to emphasize the importance of basic security hygiene for everybody who touches any part of your election process. And that starts with two-factor authentication. Microsoft did a very in-depth study of thousands and thousands of customers who were hacked. And it turns out that 99.9% of those would have been defeated if the customer had had two-factor authentication active. Now, it's not perfect. Really sophisticated bad guys have ways to, work their way around even two-factor authentication. But 99.9% is a very high number. And so, make sure that you've got two-factor authentication for any account that is touching your system, because the adversaries are going to be looking for every opportunity to find a vector into your system through an account that is not protected with two-factor authentication. So that's the first thing I would stress. The other thing, some of the things Matt talked about partitioning your network, about what we call least privileged access, just establishing your network so that only those people, those accounts who absolutely have to have access to various parts of it have that access, and really limit the number of administrative accounts that have broad access across your whole network. That's basic security 101 techniques that you should really try to adopt. But if you have two-factor authentication, if you think about how to structure your network to limit access, and if you do what we talked about earlier in terms of making sure you have a separate offline but up-to-date backup, and do the practice to make sure you know how to reestablish that backup should you need it, those would be the things I'd focus on as the basic hygiene most important for election official to be thinking about.
All right, we have our next question. This is for Matt. How do we ensure the safety of poll workers during an election that's impacted by the coronavirus?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and it's really difficult. One of the swim lane or product documents that we have up on the CISA Protect 2020 site talks about this, and really the basics are essentially creating separation, whether physically or through distance, and maintaining proper hygiene. So ensuring that you have things like sanitizer, wipes, and then creating physical barriers and or distance between people and voters, which I know is the opposite of what you would typically do in a polling place or elections operation. But the reality is the virus thrives on contact and proximity. And so trying to limit those two things, masks and hygiene being most important, are really going to be critical. And turn to your colleagues. We have several examples in the in-person voting and securing your election worker documents that talk about some practices that folks have instituted running primaries. So the building of barriers, the separation of the systems, changing the way the process works such that the voter and the poll worker aren't interacting at the same time closely together. There's a number of recommendations in those two documents that speak to that ability to either maintain that distance and maintain proper hygiene. So it's a really unique challenge. Limiting the amount of people in any given space also part of that. So I feel for election officials, this is a really tough situation to have to operate in. And the reality is, in most jurisdictions in this country, in-person voting is going to be a necessity. And so you're having to figure this out as we move forward.
Great, thanks, Matt. Running up on time here. I think to finish off, I'd like to do closing thoughts with each of the panelists. If you could do about a minute of closing thoughts, and then we'll be done. Why don't we start with Tom?
Well, in terms of closing thoughts, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to you about our thoughts and ideas. You know, whether you're talking about the Brennan Center or CISA or Microsoft or others in the private sector that are trying to help in this space, we understand at least some, probably by no means all of the challenges that you are facing in trying to prepare for this election. And we're going to do everything we can to be helpful, including this conversation and the series of conversations to follow. So we appreciate that at your time and attention very much. You know, I think you've gotten the message from the Microsoft perspective. It's that you are under attack. You are under threat. We may not be seeing the evidence of that in great quantity yet, but we still anticipate that it's coming. And so you do need to be prepared. And that means the basic hygiene, thinking through, especially as you're changing your voting process because of COVID, think what that means in terms of how you are now exposing new opportunities for bad guys to hack into your system, and how do you protect those? How do you keep your network well partitioned and safe? Two-factor authentication, practice your recovery process, and that's the best advice I can give. But do know that this is a real threat, and you should anticipate that you may very well be under attack.
Great. Next.
I want to thank everyone for participating and listening in. I want to thank the so many election officials that have helped us at the Brennan Center put together our recommendations for what it is that you all need, given what you're facing at the current moment. And I hope that many of you participate in the future sessions where we're going to take a deeper dive into some of these topics like ransomware. And I hope also that those of you who are planning to participate in future sessions, let us know what topics you really want to delve into further, so that we can do what we can to help you.
That wrap us up.
Yep, appreciate it, Chris. Thank you for being willing to moderate this, and to my fellow panelists, really appreciate everything you all are doing. My quick two thoughts are, these are unprecedented times. They already were before COVID, to be honest, as we looked at this election, but there's also unprecedented support, whether it's in the form of support for election officials from folks at CISA and the federal government, whether it's the private sector and the resources that are being offered by a number of private sector entities around cybersecurity, or your traditional election vendors. I will tell you that the Sector Coordinating Council and Government Coordinating Council came together on these COVID documents very quickly to share information and partner with CISA and the EAC to get it out. There's a real commitment from the nonprofit sector and academia to really push information, as we heard on this call. So there's a number of resources out there. Take advantage, particularly local election officials, take advantage of some of those freely available resources that are there for you, because I know the amount of information being thrown is overwhelming. But identify where your risks lie, identify what information and systems you're running, and then look to see what's available to help you protect from DDoS, or help you implement two-factor authentication, or to help you upgrade or patch your systems. That there's any number of folks that are out there trying to support and provide local election officials the kind of information and technical services they need. From CISA's perspective, we're there to help you. It's our job. We love doing it. And so please don't hesitate to reach out if you need information. If you need a cyber hygiene scanner or penetration test, that's what we're there to do. And please don't hesitate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks for everyone attending the event today. Hope you got something great out of it. Have a great day.